The skeleton of this child is now to be subjected to the full scope of modern pathological examination methods. How old was it? What did it eat? How did it live? What did it suffer from? How did it die? Around the thigh bones, the pathologist and historian Karin Wilczke discovers something unusual, a kind of deposit on the bone surface. It can also be found on the teeth, different symptoms of one and the same phenomenon, hunger.
From the example of the bones we've seen of this 12 to 14-year-old child from the early Middle Ages, we can see deposits on the long bones of the thigh and the tibia and fibula, which indicate the occurrence of bleeding during lifetime. This is caused by nutritional deficiencies, such as a lack of vitamin C, for instance, over a long period. This deficiency slows down or weakens the immune system, and the slightest infection can result in death.
Examination under the microscope confirms the analysis. This child was malnourished, displaying symptoms we know today mostly from the Sahel region. The child, however, didn't live in Africa. It lived here, but 800 years too early. Tiny furrows like very fine lines. Hunger caused the child's bones to waste away. The examination result shows it never reached adulthood. And this child is not an isolated case.
This child comes from a town population where people lived very closely together. There were also famines. Illness could spread quickly and universally. Our experience shows that 50% of children died before they even reached adulthood.
Hunger, disease, even the death of their companions did not seem to have distracted the children from their goal. Was it the promise of paradise, or was it that their faith fed them the energy to survive? Those who were physically fit enough marched on, and sometimes received gifts. Monks may have given them a pig, enabling them to trade a little, or keep themselves in food for a few days or a week. They march on without the slightest idea of time. Will they reach their destination in a month or even in a week? Each day, the holy city of Jerusalem seems closer. What effect would the spectacle of a Gothic cathedral have had on these children? Was this not the sight of heaven on earth? Was this huge, light-flooded space not a taste of the paradise that awaited them in Palestine? For these children, God was a familiar authority. In messages of unknown origin and in celestial signs, He had manifested Himself to them.
Did you witness visions or other supernatural apparitions? The falling sickness or demonic possession? Did anyone speak in tongues? Did manuscripts appear which Christ Himself had written? Speak. In France, such things happened every day.
The heavens were suddenly ablaze. God spoke to us all, that much was clear. It was as if He wanted to open up the heavens and descend from a great ball of fire. We were afraid, but Nicholas wept for joy. In this night he said to us, God had given him a sign.
What had happened in this April night of the year 1212? What did the night sky look like in Cologne and Troyes in that spring? Did anything unusual happen? Astronomical abnormalities such as constellations of stars which give rise to particular celestial phenomena. What was behind these ominous flames in the heavens? The planetarium in Bochum. Astronomers are working on the most advanced star projectors in the world. We are about to embark on a journey through time. We programmed the computer to the location Cologne, 1212, mid-April. The orbits of the celestial bodies are known. The paths are mathematical formulas. The course of the stars over 800 years compressed into a few moments. This is what the night sky in 1212 looked like. This is what the children saw. Nothing unusual. For the period between 1208 and 1220, the astronomers checked for the occurrence of supernova phenomena and comets in the celestial sphere over Europe. Again, the result is negative. Yet Nicholas and Stephen could have experienced a highly unusual celestial phenomenon, which they interpreted as a sign from God.
The best explanation is perhaps the polar lights, because they move very quickly and have perhaps the closest resemblance to the impression of fire in the sky.
The polar lights, a rare but explainable phenomenon. 800 years ago, however, a religious message.
For the people at that time, God spoke through nature, and lights were, of course, especially impressive. The northern lights, or lightning with thunder. And for children who were even more impressionable, the effect was even stronger. And so there's now this vision, the idea that God is speaking to them, saying, "Begin, go, it's the right thing." It was confirmation that this impulse came from God, and we are chosen to do His bidding and march.
Setting forth from the Rhine plain around Cologne, leaving the safety and familiarity of their towns and villages, they are confronted with mighty mountainous landscapes. Rupert and his companions have travelled 700 kilometres.
It was the mightiest thing I had ever seen. The huge mountains. Their peaks reaching up into the clouds, and it seemed to us as if their pathways led directly up to heaven.
How might the children have perceived these mountain ranges and the deep valleys? As sublime nature, a creation of the very God whose bidding they were doing? At this point, they were blissfully unaware that they were heading for disaster.
The children were overwhelmed by the Alps. They came from flat regions and had never seen such landscapes, had never seen pictures of them and had no imagination of them at all. And now they were there, experiencing nature, but also, and especially, experiencing God. This sheer magnificence was God speaking to them, and so could only confirm them, even intoxicate them in their belief.
Wolfenbüttel Library. What little we know of the Children's Crusade is kept archived here. Only written chronicles provide some indication of the drama that has left no traces at all. Concealed behind armoured steel, the original manuscripts from the 13th century, commentaries and chronicles about the Crusade of the Children, a collection of immeasurable historical value. Remarkably, the reports of the Children's Crusade are contradictory. Some praise the children's idealism. Others warn of their presumptuousness. Sometimes, the children are held up as an example for adults, and then again as mere tools of Satan. It reads as if a dispute between secular opposition and church authority is being fought out here in medieval Latin and calligraphic perfection.
The official church was astounded by this movement and taken completely by surprise. Who are these children? What do they want? What do they think they're doing? This obscure, ragged rabble, do they really believe they can succeed where kings, nobles and knights had failed? So the children were met with disdain, contempt and sometimes even wickedness, which brings in the devil, the answer to all questions. Ultimately, it's always the work of the devil.
The written word is a weapon, an unintentional mistake, or the conscious alteration of a text. A document, for example, can mean affluence or misery. With this weapon, I can destroy people, even beyond the grave. Destroy ideas.
These manuscripts are not historical records. They contain no scientific objectivity. These documents and sources pose many questions. Did the Children's Crusade break some taboo? Because they were not authorized by the Pope? Because they propagated fundamental Christian poverty? Because they criticized the pomp of the Church? Among medieval chroniclers, researchers have made out two distinct camps, pro and contra.
The
phenomenon we have here is that in the reports of the Children's Crusade, chroniclers from poor backgrounds, those from within the mendicant or ascetic orders, the Cistercians for instance, wrote very favourably with great benevolence. On the other hand, authors from the conservative orders, the rich prelate orders or from episcopal circles were highly critical and dismissed the Children's Crusades as the work of the devil.
In the children's daily struggle, the ideas being disputed here were not their greatest priority. Without any help, they were facing one single enemy, the cruelty of nature.
It got colder and colder. The little ones simply lay down and died. Many still only had their summer clothes and had rags wrapped around their feet. The icy wind tore right through them and stopped them in their tracks. We simply counted our steps, and in the end, everything disappeared as if covered by a white cloth. I saw children in their bare feet in the icy snow, their toes black as coal. Every day a small part of us died. We were crossing a white hell, and in our heads the devil spoke, saying, "Lie down and sleep. Sleep, for God has forgotten you." And they believed him.
The sources provide no information at all on what really happened in the Alps. The children were certainly the victims of their own carefree abandon. Why did no one stop them, warn them, or equip them, or offer them any help? These questions will have to remain unanswered. This children's march was undertaken beyond the scope of ecclesiastical power and the Church's protection. They had risked everything and were left completely to their own devices.
Their shoes and clothing were miserable. They had little or no food, no help, wild animals, and they didn't even know which way to go. Where was God's help? One after another they perished. Despair was all that remained of their Christian enthusiasm and their great ideal.
How did Christianity's supreme pontiff, Pope Innocent III, react to this grand ideal, or to the tragedy the young pilgrims suffered? What do the chroniclers tell us about the voice of God's representative on earth? Does he give the children of the cross his papal blessing? Here too, the accounts are contradictory.
The conservative clerical sources report of the Pope's hostility to the enterprise. He's reported to have said, "Now these poor children have unknowingly taken the crusade vow, and this vow is binding." Only they are incapable of fulfilling it, and now he must oblige them to perform the crusade once they reach adulthood. Words of admonishment, as it were, against the children's crusade. The more sympathetic sources, however, from mendicant and ascetic orders, express a totally different view. The words they put into innocents' mouth are, "Look at what these children do, and we, the clergy, the nobility, we sleep."
800 kilometers along the River Loire to Marseille. That is the route the French children take. Just before they reach the Mediterranean, great trepidation may well have taken hold. Will the waters really part?
Stretch out thine hand over the sea and divide it in the middle. That's not the way it was it not? Nothing was divided. What do you think Stephen felt on reaching the Mediterranean Sea?
They will have been as hurt and distressed as we are.
Let us imagine the scenario. Emaciated, exhausted, kept alive solely by the prospect of the Holy Land, the world suddenly fell apart around them. Stephen's prophecy is not fulfilled. The sea remains as it is. No heavenly sign, not the slightest indication. Disappointment turns to horror and dismay. Is Stephen, their prophet, a charlatan? He promised them heaven on earth, but they went through hell. They believed Stephen, and many paid for this faith with their lives. How great must their disappointment and bitterness have been? Suddenly everything is called into question. Was the entire march, the hardships, the dead, all to no avail? And Stephen, the little prophet, did he too finally lose all hope in the face of this desperate situation? Was his divine vision no more than a delusion? Had there been no heavenly command at all? One common ideal had held the multitude of children together. But what happens when confidence gives way to despair? Questions arise. Have they followed a swindler? Are they victims of the devil? Have they even put their salvation at risk? It is conceivable that they were not prepared to give up on their ideal so quickly. So they resort to pleading, lamenting, and beseeching in order to beg for the promised miracle. And suddenly, God seems to hear their pleas. The miracle occurs. Jerusalem once again seems to be within reach. What happens now is documented in the Chronicle of Alberic of Trois-Fontaines. The rescuers are Hugo Ferreus and William Porcus, two merchants from Marseille. They offer to take the children across the sea in their ships. God sending ships. That's how it must have seemed to the desperate children. Their miracle actually happens. September 1212. Hugo Ferreus and William Porcus are prepared to take the children on their ships to Palestine for the sake of God and without price. Hugo Ferreus and William Porcus are merchants with trading posts in North Africa. The chronicles tell of 7 ships. They are stout, big-bellied trading vessels built for barrels, sacks and crates, but not for passengers. 7 ships for 5,000 children. Everyone wants a place on board, a passage to the promised land. That leads to struggles breaking out for the limited space. Those who fall overboard drown. Others are left behind in Marseille. Those who do get on board consider themselves lucky. None suspect that they are now the merchandise of slave traders. Were Phareus and Paucus really the divine helpers, the allies sent by heaven to assist them in their quest to liberate Jerusalem? Though they have their doubts, the prospect of soon being in Jerusalem, in paradise, blinds them to their fate. But their ordeal on board is tortuous. The children must endure the sheer hell of the sea journey. There are over 500 on each of the vessels. In high seas, they have to go below deck. Crammed together like cattle, there's scarcely any air to breathe. The overcrowding on the ships will have made it impossible to provide an adequate supply of food. The stench is unbearable. Seasickness and infections spread. And yet again they are confronted with the cruelty of nature. Off Sardinia, a storm brews that soon becomes a hurricane. In such enormous seas, the children must have been in a permanent state of mortal fear. 2 of the ships are eventually smashed into the rocky cliffs of San Pietro and sink, taking the lives of more than 1,000 children. The remaining ships set course for North Africa. There, the surviving children are sold on the slave markets. They left their homes and their families to free the Holy Sepulchre from the Saracens, but they end up in North Africa as the slaves of princes and merchants. It is said that 400 children are fortunate enough to pass into the possession of a caliph, who treats them well out of respect for their religion. Others die a martyr's death because they are not prepared to reject the Christian faith. None of the children ever cast eyes on Jerusalem. In public consciousness, the children have been forgotten for centuries. There are no memorials in the squares of our cities to recall their tragedy. Ironically, we owe the only monument to their existence to those children who lost their lives on the cliffs off San Pietro. Here on San Pietro, 20 years after the ships went down, Pope Gregory IX built a church, which he named the Chapel of the New Innocents. A gesture of reconciliation, perhaps, for the transgressions of his predecessor. Over time, the chapel fell into ruin before being rediscovered in the 19th century. Apart from this tiny chapel and a few pages of written manuscript, there is nothing to remember those thousands of children who were determined to accomplish a divine mission and in doing so lost their lives or were enslaved. The only traces remaining are kept by the priest of the little chapel.
The only trace is the one you have seen here beneath the church. The children drowned off the coast of our island and were washed up onto the shore by the sea. Their remains were gathered together and buried here as historical testimony. It's what the Pope himself wanted. So they are buried down here, and obviously, with the passage of time, not very much is left of them. But we know that they're here, below us.
Bone dust is all that remains. Very few succeeded in returning to Europe. And it's to one of them that we owe the very little that we know.
You were one of those who survived. as a slave of the infidel. Did you have to reject your faith?
Have you seen the great desert?
No.
I have seen it.
Was it worth the price? All the dead? And the long years of slavery? You were marching to your doom.
We all have to die. Even the monks. Some sooner, some later. What is better, my lord? Leading a miserable life, knowing that death can still come every day, or
living as a slave?
Knowing what kind of world lies beyond the horizon.
Thousands of children lose their lives for an ideal. They believe they are doing God's bidding and endure insufferable agonies. Even today, this unique chapter in history moves our emotions, for it tells a story of deep medieval piety, but also one of poverty, misery, and violence. They were hoping for a paradise on earth. They dreamed of not having to go hungry, of being free. And the legacy of the Children's Crusades? By peaceful means, armed only with a great idea, they wanted to set an example for the world.